Hello students, today I am going to teach you the normal lateralis. Bones seen in normal lateralis are the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, greater sphenoid bone, the occipital bone, zygomatic bone, the maxilla and the nasal bone. Now coming to the features seen in normal lateralis. Temporal lines. There are two temporal lines, superior and inferior temporal line. Both the temporal lines meet with each other anteriorly, while their posterior end remains separated. The posterior end of inferior temporal line turns downward and forward and become continuous with the supramastoid crest. This is the supramastoid crest. Now the supramastoid crest continues forward with the posterior root of zygomatic arch. This is the posterior root of zygomatic arch. Now coming to the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch, it is formed by the part of two bones, zygomatic and temporal bone. It has upper border, lower border, medial surface and lateral surface. The anterior end of upper border of zygomatic arch is called as jugal point. So this is the jugal point. The posterior end of zygomatic arch is connected to the squamous part of the temporal bone by two roots, the anterior root and posterior root. Now coming to the articular tubercle. Articular tubercle, it is situated near the lower border of zygomatic arch. This is the articular tubercle, which is situated near the lower border of zygomatic arch, and it is present between the anterior and posterior root of zygomatic arch. Now coming to the anterior root of zygomatic arch. The anterior root of zygomatic arch, it passes medially in front of articular fossa. It passes medially in front of articular fossa. This is the articular fossa. Okay. And this is the anterior root. So anterior root, it passes medially in front of articular fossa. Now coming to the posterior root. This is the posterior root. The posterior root of zygomatic arch, it passes backward along the lateral margin of articular fossa or the mandibular fossa. This is the mandibular or articular fossa, and this is the lateral margin of articular fossa. Okay. So the posterior root, it passes backward along the lateral margin of mandibular fossa, then above the external acoustic meatus, and then it becomes continuous with the supramastoid crest. Then posterior root, it becomes continuous with the supramastoid crest. Now coming to the external acoustic meatus. This is the external acoustic meatus. Okay. This is the external acoustic meatus. It is situated behind the mandibular or articular fossa and in front of the mastoid process of the mastoid part of the temporal bone. Okay. So there is one triangle, important triangle situated in relation to the external acoustic meatus, that is called as suprameatal triangle. So this is the suprameatal triangle, which is situated in the posterior superior part of the external acoustic meatus. Now boundaries of this suprameatal triangle is important. It is bounded above by the supramastoid crest. Suprameatal triangle, it is bounded above by the supramastoid crest. It is bounded in front by the posterior superior margin of the external acoustic meatus. It is bounded in front by the posterior superior margin of the external acoustic meatus, and it is bounded behind by a vertical tangent drawn to the posterior margin of external acoustic meatus. It is bounded behind by the vertical tangent drawn to the posterior margin of external acoustic meatus. So this is the suprameatal triangle. Now coming to the mastoid part of the temporal bone. This is the mastoid part of the temporal bone. It gets articulated with the parietal bone at the parietomastoid suture and with the occipital bone at the occipitomastoid suture. So this is the parietomastoid suture and this is the occipitomastoid suture. At the junction of these two is the lower end of lambdoid suture. This is the lambdoid suture and this is the lower end of lambda suture. So at this point you get three sutures: paratomastoid, occipitomastoid, and lambda suture. So this point is called as asterion. Okay, this point is called as asterion. Similar to asterion, there is pterion. There is presence of pterion. This is the pterion where four sutures meet. Where the four sutures meet. That is sutures present between the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and the greater wing of sphenoid bone. Okay, so at the level of pterion, you get four sutures joining the four bones, that is the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and greater wing of sphenoid bone. So pterion is an important bony landmass. Uh, just behind the pterion, you get three important structures: the middle meningeal vein, the anterior division of middle meningeal artery, and the stem of lateral sulcus. So these are the three important structures situated deep to this pterion. Now coming to the parts of temporal bone. There are total four parts of temporal bone: uh, mastoid part, temporal part, petrous part, and tympanic part. Out of this four part, three parts are seen in Norma lateralis. This is the mastoid part, squamous part, and this is the mastoid part, squamous part, and this is the tympanic part of the temporal bone. The petrous part of the temporal bone is seen in the interior of the skull. Now, present between the tympanic part of the temporal bone and the mastoid part of the temporal bone, there is one important fissure that is called as tympanomastoid fissure. That is called as tympanomastoid fissure. Now, this mastoid part of the temporal bone, it projects downward. So this downward nipple-like projection of the mastoid part of the temporal bone is called as mastoid process. So this downward nipple-like projection of mastoid part of the temporal bone is called as mastoid process. Now coming to the two important fossa seen in relation to the this Norma lateralis. First, temporal fossa. The temporal fossa, it is boundaries of temporal fossa. Temporal fossa, it is bounded above by the temporal line. It is bounded below by the upper part of the zygomatic arch, upper border of the zygomatic arch laterally, and the infratemporal crest of greater wing of sphenoid bone medially. Okay, so uh, this temporal fossa, it is bounded below by the upper border of zygomatic arch laterally and the infratemporal crest of greater wing of sphenoid bone medially. So this infratemporal crest of greater wing of sphenoid bone, it is seen nicely in the Norma basalis. So this will again cover in Norma basalis. Through the gap between medial and lateral part, the temporal fossa gets communicate with the infratemporal fossa. Temporal fossa gets communicate with the infratemporal fossa through the gap deep to the zygomatic arch. The anterior wall of temporal fossa, it is formed by the parts of frontal bone and the sphenoid bone. Anterior wall of the temporal fossa, it is formed by the zygomatic bone. It is formed mainly by the zygomatic bone and partly by the sphenoid bone and parts of sphenoid bone and the frontal bone. So this you can see here, this is the anterior wall of temporal fossa, and this part, it is formed by the zygomatic bone. This part is formed by the greater sphenoid bone, and this part is formed by the part of the frontal bone. So this is the anterior wall of temporal fossa. Now coming to the floor of temporal fossa, uh, interior part of the interior part of this is the floor of temporal fossa. Okay, this is the floor of temporal fossa. The interior part of the floor, it is crossed by the S-shaped suture, that is that point is called as pterion, which just now I have covered. Now coming to the another fossa, that is infratemporal fossa. So coming to the boundaries of infratemporal fossa, this infratemporal fossa, it will again cover in Norma basalis, and it is nicely seen in Norma basalis. Okay, so coming to the roof of infratemporal fossa, the roof is formed medially by the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of sphenoid bone and by the part of squamous part of the temporal bone. The roof is formed by infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. This is the roof of infratemporal fossa. It is formed by the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of sphenoid bone and the part of squamous part of the temporal bone. Okay, this is the squamous part of the temporal bone, and this is the infratemporal surface of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. So this much part, it forms this roof of infratemporal fossa. Okay, but the lateral part of the roof, it is empty. The lateral through the lateral part of the roof, the infratemporal fossa gets communicate with the temporal fossa deep to the zygomatic arch. Okay, so medially the roof is formed by squamous part of the temporal bone and infratemporal surface of the greater wing of sphenoid bone, and laterally the roof is incomplete, through which it communicates with the temporal fossa deep to the zygomatic arch. It gets communicated with the temporal fossa deep to the zygomatic arch. Now coming to the floor, this is the roof. Floor is open. Floor of this infratemporal fossa, it is open. Now coming to the medial wall. Medial wall, this is the medial wall of the infratemporal fossa. Medial wall of the infratemporal fossa, it is formed by the lateral pterygoid plate. It is formed by the lateral pterygoid plate. This is the lateral pterygoid plate. Okay. So the medial wall is formed by the lateral pterygoid plate and the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. And the pyramidal process of the, this is the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. So this is the medial wall of infratemporal fossa, which is formed by lateral pterygoid plate and the pyramidal process of the palatine bone. Now coming to the lateral wall. Lateral wall, it is formed by the ramus of the mandible. So here comes the ramus of the mandible. Okay, so the ramus of the mandible, it forms the lateral wall of infratemporal fossa. Now coming to the anterior wall. Anterior wall of the infratemporal fossa, it is formed by the infratemporal or the posterior surface of the maxilla. So this is the maxilla, okay, and this is the posterior surface of the maxilla. So the interior wall of infratemporal fossa, it is formed by the posterior surface of the maxilla and also by the medial surface of zygomatic bone. Okay, so this is the zygomatic bone. This is the medial surface of the zygomatic bone. So the interior surface of interior wall of the infratemporal fossa, it is formed mainly by the posterior surface of the maxilla and partly by the medial surface of the zygomatic bone. Now coming to the important attachments seen in Norma lateralis. First, temporal fascia. Temporal fascia is attached to the superior temporal line and area between the two temporal lines. Temporal fascia is attached to the superior temporal line and area between the two temporal lines. Now coming to the temporalis muscle. Temporalis muscle, it arises from the temporal fossa. It arises from the whole of the temporal fossa. Now coming to the masseter muscle. Origin of masseter. Masseter arises from the medial surface and the lower border of the zygomatic arch. Masseter arises from the medial surface and lower border of the zygomatic arch. Now coming to the lateral ligament of the temporomandibular joint. Lateral ligament of the temporomandibular joint, it is attached to the articular tubercle. Okay, I have told that this is the articular tubercle which is situated near the lower border of the zygomatic arch in between the interior and posterior root of zygomatic arch. Okay, so to this articular tubercle there is attachment of lateral ligament of temporomandibular joint. Now coming to the attachments on the mastoid process. To the mastoid process, to the posterior part of the mastoid process, there is attachment of three muscles. There is insertion of three muscles: sternocleidomastoid, splenius capitis, and longissimus capitis. So posterior part of the mastoid process, there is attachment of there is insertion of three muscles: sternocleidomastoid, splenius capitis, and longissimus capitis. Now coming to the relations. Through the gap present deep to the zygomatic arch, through which the temporal fossa gets communicated with the infratemporal fossa, there is passage of three important structures. First, tendon of temporalis muscle, then temporal vessels, and deep temporal vessels and deep temporal nerve. So three important structures: temporalis, tendon of temporalis muscle, deep temporal vessels, and deep temporal nerve. Now coming to the structures passing through important foramen. First, tympanomastoid fissure. This is the tympanomastoid fissure through which there is passage of auricular branch of vagus nerve. Okay, tympanomastoid fissure, there is transmits the auricular branch of vagus nerve. Now mastoid foramen. This is the mastoid foramen. Okay, this is the mastoid foramen. Mastoid foramen transmits an imaginary vein connecting the sigmoid air sinus with the posterior auricular vein, and it also transmits the meningeal branch of the occipital artery. Now coming to the zygomaticotemporal foramen. This is the zygomatic bone. Okay, this is the zygomatic bone, and this is the zygomaticotemporal foramen. Okay, this foramen you can see here, that is the zygomaticotemporal foramen, which transmits zygomaticotemporal nerve. So this is all about Norma lateralis. Thank you.